I was born in Grand Prairie in 1952, and we lived there for most of my life until my wife and I got married in 1976. We moved out to Hurst at that time right there on Bel Air and Pecan Manor in the Pecan Manor apartments. And we lived there for for about 6 or 7 months, and then we decided, okay, it's time to quit letting that rent money go down the drain, and we bought a house. I guess we've owned 3 houses in the 42 years, over 42 years we've been married, and we loved Hurst when we moved there, and we still love Hurst 42 years later. Dad was in the Navy, and Mom worked a couple of different jobs. For a while, she stayed home, took care of the kids. But Dad was in the I guess the branch of the Navy where you spent 20 years and then you were done. And he had a twin brother. They both joined the Navy at the same time, but his twin brother joined the regular Navy. Well, Dad spent 18 years at Navy Dallas. And they came to him and they said, we can't allow someone to spend their entire 20 years in the military and stay in one duty station. So you got about 2.5 years left, so you got a choice. You can either go to Memphis or you can go to Los Alamitos, which was Anaheim, California. Dad's twin brother at the time was down in San Diego, so off to California we went. And so for about, I guess, my 3rd, 4th, and 5th grades in elementary school, I was 2 miles from Disneyland and 1 mile from Knott's Berry Farm. And all the relatives would come out and visit, and I'd get to take them and show them around Disneyland. After he retired from the Navy, we came back to Grand Prairie. He worked for and this all has to do with the government and the civil service, but he worked a year for the post office, and then he went to work for General Services Administration. And they had their big depot in Fort Worth. They're around 35 in Hemphill. He went to work out there and worked out there from, until he retired at age 65. And all that time, they lived in Grand Prairie. Like I said, I spent all but 3 years in the Grand Prairie school system. The 3 years I was in California, I actually went to Walt Disney Elementary School. So, every year our field trips would be to Disneyland, so it was fantastic. But I loved getting back to Texas, getting back to Grand Prairie. I loved history, so whether it be American history or world history, that was one of my favorite subjects, as was math. I always loved to go into the math class. And it was one of those things. My dad knew everybody. He was very involved with, Pee Wee baseball, and so he was always working with kids, and as such, he knew all the teachers, knew all the coaches. And I tell everybody, if I got in trouble at school, it was nothing like what I was going to get when I got home, and there was no way I was going to keep anything secret because he knew everybody. So that was kind of growing up in Grand Prairie. I got real involved in an organization called DeMolay, and that's an organization that's sponsored by the Masonic Lodge. And once again, it was one of those things where through that organization, there was a lot we do a lot of speech type contests. And so I learned to memorize and repeat parts. And that helped me tremendously as I grew because, you memorize it and you can learn to say it, but then eventually you feel more comfortable just talking. And so that helped me tremendously as far as being able to get up and talk to an audience or a group of people. DeMolay really had a big effect on me because after I threw out my high school year and then really in the first part of my college career, I was very active and ended up becoming the state president in that organization. And I tell everybody, I met my wife through that organization. We formed a partnership, an accounting partnership called Whitley Penn, and Penn was a state master counselor or state president about 3 or 4 years after me. And so a lot of the things that I look back on in my life were as a result of DeMolay experience and DeMolay friends that I've made. My best friend, my next door neighbor, he was about a year and a half, maybe 2 years older than me, and he got a job one summer working at this ice cream shop. Well, the next summer came around, and he had an opportunity to get me a job there. And so I started out, my first job was dipping ice cream in a Carnation ice cream shop on Main Street in Grand Prairie. And what I found myself doing is after I had been at that job for probably 5 or 6 months, I started thinking, well, golly, I could do this. And that was in part caused by the fact that the owner actually had a heart attack. And as a result of that, I ended up opening the store up in the morning. I would take care of inventorying and ordering. Ultimately, I would close the store down at night and then walk put all the cash in a bag and walk it by his house and put it between the screen door and the door. And then the next day, we'd start the process over again. So I began kind of thinking about, okay, what would it take to own something like this? To buy the freezers, to rent the space, to do all of that. Little did I know that that was going to be somewhat the impetus behind me becoming a CPA or an accountant. I went to school, went to college at UTA there in Arlington, and started out as an engineering major, and decided after a bout with physics and calculus that maybe that wasn't what I was cut out to be, and went to the business department, business area, and eventually went in, got the accounting degree, became a CPA, and worked for a national firm, and then decided, okay, we can do this. So my partner and I started an accounting practice in 1983 called Whitley Penn, and it's now it's in the top 100 CPA firms in America. They have probably over 500 employees by now. They've got offices in Fort Worth, Dallas, Houston, Austin. It's with great pride that I look back and see what's been accomplished since 1983 for the firm. Got married right after I got out of, it was actually 2 months before I graduated from college. My wife, who I met again as a result of DMLA, lived in Wichita Falls, went to school at North Texas, and got a teaching degree. Both of her parents were teachers. And she did her student teaching in Grapevine, Colleyville, there at Colleyville Elementary. And after her student teaching, they offered her a position. But she went to work there in 1975, so she graduated from college in 3 years. We were married in 76. I went to work for Ernst & Ernst in downtown Fort Worth in September of 76. And we moved into the Hearst area, she working in Colleyville, me working in Fort Worth. That just seemed like a good place to be. And at the same time, it was far enough away from the relatives that we thought there'd be no drop-in visits. We lived there really right up from Bell Helicopter, there on Bel Air. It was a little duplex right there on the corner of Pecan and Bel Air. It was still very much undeveloped land, and there was still a lot of room to grow and and Hearst to build out. And we had a couple that we had known for several years invited us to visit with them. The First United Methodist Church there in Hearst. We continued going to the church, I guess probably for almost a year. And I remember the senior minister, Lively Brown at the time, came up to me and he says, I want you to be a delegate to the annual conference from our church. And I said, well, boy, I think I'd really enjoy that. And he said, the only thing is you need to join before we can do that. And we laughed, and so we went down the next Sunday and joined the church. But what I really remember about that church sits right there on Pipeline and Hurstview. You got to know where it is. It's not one of the ones you see from the freeway. And usually just about every Sunday after church, we would go to this little restaurant right there at Pipeline and Mary. And it looked to me like it was an old church that that the restaurant was in. And I remember going there one Sunday, and we were sitting in this booth, and this older man just came in and sat down beside my wife and started talking. And I'm sitting, and we both kind of looked at each other and say, who is this guy? It was C.A. Sanford. And so that was C.A.'s. And, anybody who had been in Hearst knew who C.A. was. And it was just, he was just that friendly. And everybody was. And that's something that we really liked about the community. And that it just kind of sealed that, yeah, we were going to live in Hurst, we were going to go to church in Hurst, we were going to raise our kids, raise our family in Hurst. And we did. It had already relocated into that, Marion pipeline down in that area, but there was an A-frame church at that point in time. And I remember I was on the building committee. I've been on just about every committee that the church has had. And I remember being on that building committee when we moved from that A-frame into the now existing sanctuary. Henry Roddy was the senior minister at that point in time, and he and Squeaky, he had the little church mouse that he used. And when we actually built the new sanctuary, we had a window outside in the little Northex area, and in the old A-frame, we always had problems with birds getting into the church, and they'd get up in the rafters. And so when we created this stained glass window, in that, we had a little bird down here, but we also had Squeaky the church mouse. And that was out of respect and for Henry and the work that he did with our church. Our kids were raised by Squeaky. We had 3 children, and they were all born and baptized and raised in that church, and it was something that was very important to us that they be in a church where they would be with kids that they went to school with on a daily basis and then would go to church with on Sunday. That church has always been very mission-oriented and has looked beyond just its own members, but has looked out to what can we do for not only other folks around the world, but also other folks around the community. We created Mission Central. We have once a month, even today, once a month, the food bank brings in a big tractor trailer load of food, and folks are there to pass that out. So for whatever the reason is, the folks there have always had a real passion to work outside of the church. I will tell you that from the very get-go, Reg and Edna Anderson were founders of not only the Hurst, but also of that church. I knew them certainly much more from the church's perspective, but I remember that when we first went to the church, there was this gentleman that was in the Northex, and he would shake the hand of everybody who came through that door, and that was Reg Anderson. And I think everybody looked at Reg as being this, he was the leader of the family, and he was the person that, took care of everything. And then when he passed away, everybody realized that Edna was the woman behind the man. And Edna stepped up, and she did so much for our church. And one of the things that the church did before she passed was they would just go over and sit down and have conversations much like we're having here. And she would tell stories of growing up in the church. I remember her telling the story of when she was a teenager. They decided they were going to play this trick on a bunch of the parents, and they switched the babies. They took and put the little cribs in different buggies, and so it wasn't until some of them got home and looked and realized that wasn't their child, and she said, "Boy, did we get in trouble over that one." But she was in the church from its very beginning, and just had some fantastic stories. You've got 3, 4, 5 generations in many instances inside of that church. On any given Sunday, we might have a quorum of the city council in our, in the sanctuary, and at times they were passing the plates. Harris HEB Hospital Board, Senior Minister Sidney Roberts, who was at First Hurst, asked me if I would be willing to serve on that board, and he got me on there. And I was very excited to serve on that board. But that was kind of my first toe in the water. And, they had the hospital had its foundation, but I said, that's kind of like giving to your brother. We need to be giving to the community. And at that point in time, I was involved with the schools, but not on the school board yet. And what I recognized and what I realized was that the schools, all the schools needed a school nurse. And so what better thing for the hospital to do than to help fund school nurses in each one of the schools. So we did that as a beginning point. We had another employee, I think our CFO at the time at the hospital, he was in the Birdville, so we followed that up with doing the same thing in the Birdville ISD. We started out putting the nurses in each one of the schools, and it's worked out well. Later on, my wife now works for the hospital out there. She had the hospital give AEDs to all of the schools, and then in this past year, I went a step with Cooks and UNT Health Science Center, and we put nebulizers in all of the schools for any school district in the county that wanted one. Cooks paid for it, and we placed nebulizers, trained the nurses on how to administer the treatments for kids who have asthma issues. Worked on the P&Z for a number of years. Joe Fuchs, Anna Hauser trained me. You know, she'd say she trained me on that, and then she moved on to the city council. I moved on and ran for the school board, was elected to HEB school board in 1993 and served until 96. And what you have people who are committing their lives to educating our kids. And I can't think of a more noble group of people to be around. Georgia Kidwell. You had, again, Don Brown. You had folks in the school system, Lorraine Tatterich, Larry Manier, David Miller, George Ann Gallion. These were folks who were on the school board and who gave tremendous amounts of time over years, over decades. On the school board, I tell you what we got. We'd get dinner when we'd go to the school board meetings. And then the real bright spot was when we'd start the meeting and the kids would come up and they might present us with cookies or brownies or something along that lines and talk about what was going on in the school. And those are the rewards that you get for a lot of that type of service. And these folks gave untold hours away from their families to be able to do this and to make that kind of a commitment to make this a better place, to raise kids and to live our lives. Most, if not all, could go and could make a whole lot more money other places, but there's that commitment to public service. And I will say that I think when I went from the private sector to the public, to public service, is where I really began to realize that. As a private sector, we are, right, wrong, or indifferent, more focused sometimes on the dollars that we make as opposed to what we may be doing. As I've moved into the public service, I very quickly realized that these people who are just as talented could be making much more money, but they're focused, they have a passion or a talent for public service, for helping others. And that's where they get their passion. I guess it was in late 95, I had some friends approach me and say, "Have you ever thought about running for county commissioner?" And I said, "Well, you're going to have to tell me what county commissioner is, and I might think about running for it." They explained the thing that attracted me to it was the elected officials in the county are the only place where your elected officials are actually full-time and implement and run the business. I will tell you that George Ann Gallion and Larry Manier were on the school board when I first joined the school board, and I remember the first meeting, them taking me back into the executive session back room and saying, we know you wouldn't do this. George Ann knew me very well, and she was laughing when she said this, but she said, as school board members, you have three responsibilities. You set the budget, you approve the tax rate, you hire and fire the superintendent. Now, nowhere in there did you hear you go into little Johnny's classroom and tell the teacher how to run the class, or go onto the football field and tell the coach how to run the football game. And most of the school districts that you hear about getting in trouble, it's usually because one of the trustees has decided that they know how to run the school better than the principal or the teacher. And so it was very sage advice, but as I said, George Ann knew me, and she knew of my love of getting into the detail. So when they came along and explained to me that as county commissioner, I was able to get into the detail and was charged with getting into the detail, I loved it. I'd been involved with the accounting firm. It had grown. I was at the point where I could afford, with a family, with kids still in high school, but that I could afford to take the cut and pay and go into public service, and I did, and I've never looked back. There were actually 5 of us in that race. One was a 12-year incumbent, Bob Hampton, and then it was myself, who was serving on the school board at that time, Harold Samuels, who had been the mayor in Euless, Ed Baker, who had been the mayor in Colleyville, and then a gentleman by the name of Lewis Lowe, who had been active in the Republican Party. And I ended up the one to get into the runoff, and they supported me, and I ended up beating Bob in the runoff. And it was really my first getting into the partisan political arena, because school board is a bipartisan. I had the opportunity, and I was very privileged to serve as county commissioner for 10 years, and the gentleman to my right was Tom Vandergriff. And a little bit further over to my right was a lady by the name of Dion Bagsby, and Dion passed away this last week. But when Judge Vandergriff retired, I chose to run for his place and was elected. And at some point through that process, or maybe right after I'd been elected, Mike Moncrief, who was a former county judge and someone who I had sought advice from time to time, said this to me. He said, "You will accomplish 10 times more as county judge if you don't care who gets credit for what is accomplished." And so if you've got an idea that you really want passed, then go find a county commissioner that was also interested in that, convince them to push it, and that you'll join them in supporting doing that. And he said, if you'll do that, you'll get a whole lot more accomplished. You may not get all the credit for it, but that's okay. What you will have accomplished will be a whole lot more. And I've never forgotten that. Dion was a mentor to me also. She was the first woman and the first African American ever elected to a commissioner's court in the entire state of Texas. And I can remember several times in those first years her, just taking me aside and saying, think about this or think about that. She was a great friend and a great mentor, and we've lost a tremendous citizen for Tarrant County. This past year, I got very active in what I feel like is trying to thwart efforts at the state level to take away local control at the city, county, and school districts. And so I kind of led the charge started off with the State of the County address in Arlington, and either it's gone uphill or downhill, depending upon which side you were on that deal. But I'm very committed to making sure that folks understand that I feel like the best decisions for the citizens of a community are made by the local elected officials, by the elected officials closest to them, and not folks in Austin and not folks in D.C. And so it's been a progression of starting in the church, and that's where you always should start and always stay focused, but then again moving and trying to make it a better place, not only for you and your kids and your grandkids, but really for everybody. My wife and I have been married it'll be 43 years this June. We have 3 kids, 37, 35, and 33. They're all living here in the area. 2 over in Southwest Fort Worth, they're CPAs. 1 that lives up in McKinney. She started out, she was going to be a teacher, ended up getting a degree and has been an office manager for an oil and gas or developer type company, and then also worked for a software company. I tell everybody we have 7 grandkids. We have 5 from scratch, 2 bonus. They range in age from a sophomore in college to a 2-year-old, and there'll probably be more on the way. One of the things we liked best about Hurst and about this area was the opportunities we had to raise our kids here. Again, to church, there was a lot of activities going on. There was always, whether it be drill team, whether it be band, whether it be cheerleading, whether it be football, whether it be soccer, there were always activities for the kids. And we always felt good about that. We always felt they were safe. And it was just a great environment for us to see our kids grow up, and now to watch our grandkids grow up. You know, what I would say, and I've had an opportunity over the last 20 years that I've been on the Commissioner's Court to kind of watch cities and how they develop and what happens from time to time within those cities. And what I've come to really realize is that those cities who have been most successful are the ones that have visionaries on their city councils and who don't simply look for the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, but look far into the future. And what I'll cite as an example are transportation projects. Most of the transportation projects we see, 820, 121, 360, 2030, any of them, those are 40-year projects. From the time that you begin thinking about them until the time that you drive on them, it will very easily be a 40-year project. I often say that they were working on 360 when I was born, and they will be working on 360 when I die. In the 42 years, my wife and I have been in the city of Hurst, there have been 3 mayors, and really up until last year, there had been 2. Bill Souter, Richard Ward. And the 3rd mayor, Henry Wilson, has been on that city council the whole time and wanted to be mayor, but didn't run against Souter and wouldn't run against Ward, and waited his time, and so now he's mayor. So the 3 folks who've been the leaders in Hurst as mayor have all been on the council or around the council for over 40 years. And when you look at what's happened, when you look at the mall, when you look at City Hall, when you look at the conference center, they looked and they look out in this area and they see, whenever we want to do some big event, we have to go to Fort Worth. And they said, that's not right. So they developed a conference center. Hotels pop up around it. Now they have a hotel that's connected to it. They have the parks and the big softball parks and the water park down by the recreation center. Remember, that's right across the canal from the church, and it used to be a softball field. And now it's a tennis court, a water park, and a recreational facility. It's the Senior Citizen Center. It's revitalizing Pipeline. It's revitalizing Highway 10. It's knowing that we've got to look into the future. We can't make it happen overnight, so we got to be patient and we got to stay the course. If you have a council that's not working well together, that may be a 3-4 council and could change on the next election, then it's very difficult for a developer to risk millions upon millions of dollars when you don't know what the next election may bring. There needs to be new folks come in, but at the same time, they need to come in realizing that there's a plan, a strategic plan, and not to say that you don't alter it or don't change it, but you don't change it every 2 or 3 years just because you think you want to. It's where I raised my family. It's where I have my roots. I mean, I've lived all but 3 years of my life within a 25-mile radius of where we are today. My parents, my brother and sister still live in Grand Prairie. Family is so important, and friends, and that's what I have here. This is home. This is home, and you couldn't blow me out of it. I used to tell everybody when we first moved into our home that the only thing that would move me out of here would be the banker, and that my next home would either be someplace after the bank foreclosed on the home, or it'd be the National Cemetery. The home's taken care of. The next place that I reside will be at the National Cemetery. As I said, my dad was always very active with youth activities. He and Mom both said, you give back to the community that you live in. And that was the unwritten rule. And so I grew up knowing that I needed to get involved and that I was going to be involved as I would go forward.